All right, it's just a few minutes after the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. As we get started, I will remind you that this WebEx call is being recorded and may be posted on DOE's website or used internally. If you do not wish to have your voice recorded, please do not speak during the call. If you do not wish to have your image recorded, please turn off your camera or choose to participate by phone. If you speak during the call or use a video connection, you are presumed to consent to recording and use of your voice or image. Again, good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome you all to our 5th webinar in a series in which we summarize the work and the results from DOE's Smart Mobility Lab Consortium. My name is David Anderson. I'm the Program Manager for Energy Efficient Mobility Systems, or EEMS. EEMS is a program of the Vehicle Technologies Office, which is part of DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. The Smart Mobility Consortium is a cornerstone research effort of the EEMS program, and it's focused on understanding the system-level impacts that emerging transportation technologies and services will have on mobility, and on identifying solutions that improve mobility energy productivity. That's the energy, the time, and the affordability of transportation. Now, we've been having these webinars every 2 weeks, and we've covered the development of our smart mobility modeling workflow and the mobility energy productivity metric. We've covered results from the 2 implementations of the workflow and specific research on connected and automated vehicles. Now, today, our focus is on moving people. In the U.S., vehicles moving passengers travel 3 trillion miles every year, and this passenger volume shares our roadways with 11 billion tons of freight. Now, freight will be the focus of our next webinar in 2 weeks, but today it's people that we're focused on. Our 2 speakers today are Dr. Anna Spurlock from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Anna led the Mobility Decision Science pillar of research under Smart Mobility 1.0. And Dr. Josh Olive from Argonne National Lab. Josh was a key architect behind the Smart Mobility modeling workflow. But before I turn it over to Anna and Josh, I'll again give you some context. As I mentioned at the beginning, EEMS is one of the research programs within the Vehicle Technologies Office, or VTO. Now, many of you by now are aware of the R&D that VTO has done successfully for a long time on vehicle powertrains and component technologies. EEMS and Smart Mobility extend VTO's scope up to the transportation systems level. We look at technologies not only at the vehicle and component level, but also how vehicles interact with each other and with infrastructure at the small network and corridor level. We can then evaluate the impact that new solutions have on overall traffic flow and energy consumption. And finally, we bring people into the equation, and we work to understand the future of mobility in the context of an entire urban or metropolitan area, integrating passengers and freight, including on-road vehicles, in transit, in micromobility, and pedestrians and biking, the entire mobility system. So that's the purview of the EEMS program. Now, to make sure we execute on that charge, we've taken a multidisciplinary consortium approach to transportation research. We convened 5 of our leading national labs, including dozens of our most skilled transportation scientists and engineers, to build the Smart Mobility Laboratory Consortium. That's a multi-year, multi-laboratory collaborative dedicated to further understanding the energy implications and opportunities of advanced mobility solutions. The first phase of our consortium was divided among 5 pillars of research shown here. They are connected and automated vehicles, mobility decision science, multimodal freight, urban science, and advanced fueling infrastructure. The research results that Anna and Josh will describe today largely come from the mobility decision science focus area. But since the consortium is multidisciplinary and cross-cutting, these focus areas were very much interrelated. The research in any one area relied on activities from the other areas. And so that's why I think it's more important to look at the consortium and mobility research in general like this, as a complex system of systems. We can't really study any one area in isolation without considering the impacts that related areas have on it, which is what we set out to do through the consortium. It's a bit of a happy accident that the traveler behavior circle is the brightly colored circle in the middle of this diagram, since it comes down to people and their decision making, which ultimately drives most mobility outcomes. Now, I keep using the term mobility, so I want to remind you what we mean. We've defined mobility to mean the quality of a network or system to connect people to goods, services, and employment, the things that define a high quality of life. This definition is important because it emphasizes our focus on moving people. That's the topic of today's webinar. We're working to connect people to the things they need better and to do it affordably and efficiently, to give people access to opportunities like jobs and education, healthcare and recreation, and shopping and retail. Mobility is fundamental to our way of life. Our presentation today is divided into two parts. First, Anna Spurlock will talk about some of the empirical data analysis in the whole traveler behavioral study results that were created under Smart Mobility. She'll describe findings on topics like how do people decide which travel mode to take, what factors influence technology adoption, what lifestyle trajectories lead to vehicle dependence, what are the barriers to EV penetration, and what impact does ride-hailing have on vehicle ownership and energy use? And finally, how have consumers' e-commerce decisions impacted mobility? After Anna concludes, Josh Auld will discuss some of the modeling and simulation results generated from the Smart Mobility modeling workflow relevant to passenger movement. The Smart Mobility modeling workflow is an end-to-end multi-fidelity software toolchain built around agent-based transportation system models that capture the complex interactions among mobility decision-making, technology implementation, different mobility service models, different modes, land use, and EV charging infrastructure. It integrates freight and passenger movement and allows researchers to evaluate the energy, mobility, and affordability outcomes of potential future transportation scenarios. We can evaluate these outcomes in terms of vehicle miles traveled, travel time, energy, costs, greenhouse gas emissions, and other metrics. Now, within the context of moving people, we've asked questions like, in a future in which vehicles are connected and automated, will people buy them? How will they use them? Will they change our travel behavior? As new mobility services reach maturity, what does that mean for how people travel and for how much people travel? What does it mean for the number of cars on the road? In addition to new services, what about the new modes being introduced? Will micromobility become a viable transportation option? And if so, will it affect other modes such as transit, or will it just serve as a niche role? And what is the role of transit? We believe public transit is the backbone of any urban transportation system. So how do we make it more accessible and convenient for people? And given the pandemic's impact on transit, what is the future of public transportation? So with that background, I'll now turn it over to Anna Spurlock from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab to discuss the empirical data analysis and research findings from the mobility decision science area. Once she's done, she'll turn it over to Josh Auld to cover from Argonne National Lab to discuss simulation-based results. At the end, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A, and I encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of your questions as time allows. At this point, I will turn it over to Dr. Anna Spurlock.
Great. Thank you very much. So thanks everybody for joining. As David mentioned, I'm going to talk about the work done in, most of what I'm presenting on is work done in the mobility decision science pillar from Smart Mobility. And to give a little bit of an overview, the idea of that pillar was to examine the underlying sort of factors, the preferences, identity factors, personality, life cycle, contextual and geographic factors that contributed to people's transportation behaviors. And in particular, to understand the critical drivers of or critical barriers to adoption and use of emerging transportation technologies and services. And then to think about what those barriers and drivers mean for the implications of these technologies and services for the system. In the mobility decision science pillar, we tackled a range of topics. It was a wide-ranging set of work. And so some of the work done could be categorized into these topic areas. So life context and what that means for transportation behaviors, psychological and identity factors with regards to transportation preferences, e-commerce use and shopping travel, and the impact of ride-hailing on the transportation system. And in terms of methodological approaches, we used a variety of approaches in this pillar. So there was the whole traveler transportation behavior study, which David mentioned, which was a data collection, a survey data collection effort in the San Francisco Bay Area. So there was original data collected from that study, and then a variety of analyses that touched on all of these topics done using those data. In addition, there was work done using the agent-based transportation system simulation models that we have, including the full workflow that David mentioned. And then there was also standalone analyses on other types of data sets, touching on a couple of these topics, which I'll also talk about briefly now. So as I say, there were a lot of things that we covered in this research, and so we won't be able to talk about all of it today, but I will try to bring forth some of the more interesting salient points we had. So one thing that we did look at was, life cycle and contextual factors for people's interest in and adoption of different transportation technologies and services. So when we just think about the kind of main thread that carries us through our life cycles as we, as we age, one of the things we were looking at was how people in different sort of generational categories reflected in terms of their interest in and adoption of a variety of different technologies. And some findings were relatively expected, like consistent with other research. For example, younger generations, here the millennials, tended to drive adoption of ride-hailing in our survey. But we did have some interesting insights that tended to contribute to question marks that existed or gaps in the literature. And one thing we found, for example, was that baby boomers, which was the older of the generations that we looked at, even more so than Generation X, had a higher interest in and rate of adoption of advanced transportation vehicle technologies like electrified vehicles. So this was something we found interesting. And why it matters is when we think about how people use transportation alternatives over the course of their lives, we see that as people age, they tend to move towards more and more vehicle dependence. So in our survey data, what we showed is that as people reached about 33 in terms of age, they tended to kind of reach a pretty high rate of reporting regularly driving their personal vehicle for their main travel. And in our survey data, that was about 70% reporting that by about that age. And then it stayed kind of consistently at that level or even slightly higher thereafter. So what's interesting about thinking about preferences for new vehicle technologies is if we think about the fact that there are factors driving this shift towards more private vehicle dependence with age, understanding whether people as they get older maintain or have a high interest in different types of vehicles that might have different levels of sustainability or impacts on the rest of the system or environment can mean that there are interesting implications for, or important implications for that for kind of system level energy or other factors. When we think also about people progressing through their life cycles, one of the things we think about is, basically differences across people in how this happens. So if we take all of the participants in the survey who we used in this particular analysis that I'm going to talk about, and we kind of dump them in a bucket and look at how they progress through key life cycle events or phases, such as being in school, being employed, living with a partner, having children, this is what you get sort of on average in terms of their average progression through these phases. But what we did in our analysis is we looked at trying to understand whether there were, key different patterns in which people progress through these phases. So we used a clustering analysis to look at, to basically characterize 5 different archetypal patterns that people fall into when they progress through these phases. So to understand this, if you think about the first three here, the singles, couples, and have-it-alls, which we named just because of the nature of their patterns, one of the things you observe, these are the three most sort of prominent in terms of the percent of the sample that fell into these patterns. You see that these three progress through their career development a relatively similar pattern. They all finish school and start working in a similar rate and at a similar timing in their lives. But they all differed significantly with respect to their family formation patterns. So the singles tended to wait until later in life or choose not to live with a partner or have children. Couples, on the other hand, tended to couple up relatively quickly, similar in timing-wise to their sort of career formation, but tended to wait to have children or chose not to have children. And then have-it-alls, on the other hand, tended to couple up again relatively early, right around the time they were starting to work full-time, but very quickly thereafter had children, and almost all of them had children. There were two other smaller cohorts, so what we refer to as the late bloomers, which tended to delay most of these life cycle stages relative to some of the other cohorts, and then the family first, which tended to have family formation precede sort of schooling or career. So what some of the interesting, we learned a variety of interesting things from analyzing these cohorts, but I'll just give you one set of interesting takeaways. So this have-it-alls cohort was of particular interest. And one of the reasons that this is the case is because one of the things we found was when you look at the patterns of the mode use of these cohorts, the have-it-alls cohort, you see a relatively steep increase in the rate at which they achieve, or I don't know, achieve, but the rate at which they kind of shift towards this more significant vehicle dependence in their driving styles. And in particular, what we found is that this cohort, more than any of the others, statistically significantly increased the rate at which they were reported regularly driving at every one of their life cycle transitions. So, finishing school, becoming employed full-time, living with a partner, and having children all resulted in a statistically significant increase in the rate at which they were reporting regularly driving. And the implication of this is that this cohort, you can see, reached the highest level of vehicle dependence, the earliest of all of the cohorts, and stayed there. So when we think about the underlying needs that people have for transportation alternatives that are kind of dependent on the different forces that are acting in their lives based on their choices of how they progress through their lives and what responsibilities they have and the things they're trying to accomplish, you can see that it can have long-term implications for the kind of impact of their choices with respect to energy, for example. One of the other things we looked at was gender with respect to these different cohorts. And just to give an example of an interesting finding here, so the women in the have-it-alls cohort tended to be even more vehicle dependent than the men in the same cohort. And in particular, this related to the timing of them having children. So when having children or preparing to have children, the women in this cohort, even more so than the men, tended to engage in more family member transportation responsibilities. They used public transit even less. They moved to public transit poor areas even more. They tended to drive even more and live in households with more vehicles and live in households with bigger vehicles. So, for us, this was an interesting window into thinking about that idea of the critical drivers of or barriers to certain types of transportation choices and availability of certain alternatives, not just physically in terms of availability in terms of how close you are to that to those alternatives, but also availability with respect to whether they could fit into the type of lifestyle that one is living in. Keeping on the theme of gender, but shifting a little bit to a new topic, one of the other things we looked at was the barriers to electric vehicle adoption. And so one thing we observed in our data, which has been shown by a variety of other studies that have looked at PEV adoption or plug-in electric vehicle adoption or interest, is that there was a gender gap. We had about 15 percentage points size of difference in terms of the rate at which women in the survey responded that they were interested in adopting an electric vehicle compared to men. So we wanted to dig a little bit into what the nature of this gap was, what was driving it. So we hypothesized a variety of underlying factors. One, risk preferences of a variety of types, personality characteristics, willingness or ability to pay, transportation needs such as habits or the responsibilities in the household, and environmental attitudes. And we looked at this using what's called a mediation analysis. And what we found is that of all of those factors we entered into the analysis, they explained about 35% collectively of the gender gap. So there's definitely more, contributing to this that we don't necessarily understand yet. But in terms of some of the interesting takeaways from our analysis, we found basically, and we can frame it this way, that if women have the same income on average as men, and in our sample they tended to have on average lower income than men, then the gender gap would be about 10% smaller. And if women had the same responsibilities for transporting family members, the same need for cargo space and vehicle capacity, and the same errand running responsibilities as men, which they tended to have higher need for those things than men in our sample, the gender gap would be 15% smaller. So this, points to some of the interesting, the interesting underlying factors that might be contributing to people's willingness to take up different alternatives if they're not kind of geared towards the particular needs or requirements of a given subpopulation. So I'm going to shift gears again a little bit here and talk a little bit about ride hailing. In the whole traveler study, we did look at we did an analysis looking at ride hailing, and we did, in particular, the impact of ride hailing on public transit. And we did show that ride hailing can be both a complement and a substitute for public transit, and it depends on the relative price, and it depends on the proximity to public transit, or kind of a degree to which it's likely to impact preceding behaviors. But I don't have a slide on that particular result. I'm going to shift to a couple of other analyses that were done with other data sources under the mobility decision science pillar. So one looked at the entrance of ride-hailing services to urban centers across the U.S. and basically found that that for urban areas with lower per capita vehicle ownership and with higher rates of economic growth, ride-hailing entering the market increased the numbers of vehicle registrations by about 0.7% on average. So there was variation across different urban areas. So, we weren't able to necessarily nail down the exact reason for this, but, it begs the question of, in these areas, was it possible that people who were interested in driving for this service actually tended to acquire a vehicle that they wouldn't have otherwise, and that could have contributed to the increase in vehicle registrations. So this speaks to the fact that while ride-hailing may impact the system through the behaviors of the riders, like the whole traveler result I mentioned, they can also impact the system through the behaviors of the drivers of the service. Another similar themed result came from analysis of data from a ride-hailing service in Austin, Texas called Ride Austin. And what was found in this analysis is that mainly contributing to the fact that ride-hailing drivers commuted relatively long distances, and also due to the repositioning behavior of those drivers, the sort of deadheading behavior between picking up riders, ride-hailing resulted in an increase in system-wide energy consumption by 41 to 90%. And the variation between these depended on the assumptions used in the analysis on the rate of cooling or the modal shift that resulted from ride-hailing. So those two results, speak to the fact that there are a lot of different actors contributing to how these different alternatives function in the system, and they can all have implications for the outcomes. Finally, touching on a topic that is a quickly shifting topic in our society right now, looking at e-commerce. In the whole traveler study, what we were looking at is the degree to which e-commerce with delivery substituted for or resulted in additional deliveries without reductions in shopping trips. Now, one caveat being that this is all pre-COVID e-commerce delivery context, so I imagine things are much different now. But at that time, what we looked at was we categorized different types of shopping, so shopping for clothes, groceries, household items, or prepared meals. And, you know, this is basically just showing the relative sort of frequency of these types of shopping trips reported in our sample and the mode that was used for those shopping trips. So particularly what we found is that groceries, not surprisingly, were the most frequently purchased, but the least frequently done so through a delivery. On the other hand, clothing were least frequently purchased, but proportionally more so via delivery. And when we look at the pattern of substitution, what we found is that delivery to households both substituted for and was in addition to shopping trips. But that what we found in aggregate is that in a typical week, a given delivery was about 1.7 times as likely to substitute for a shopping trip than not. And of those that did substitute, a given delivery was about 300% more likely to substitute for a vehicle trip than a non-vehicle trip. So in aggregate, the substitution result of delivery did kind of win out against it being additional travel or activity in the system. But that depended on characteristics of the household. So I'm going to shift to passing over the presentation to Josh to talk then about some more of the system impact results of some of these topics. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So the rest of this presentation will really focus on behavioral findings that come through the application of the simulation models that have been developed as a part of the Smart Mobility program. That's the workflows that are centered around the Polaris and BEAM activity-based travel demand models. So the behavioral research that has been done is largely in service of improving and extending the smart mobility workflow, as I mentioned. This includes taking findings from surveys, data, other simulation study analysis, and other sources, and developing models of a wide range of demand and behavior-focused aspects of individual and groups. The goal being to take these models and extend the existing smart mobility workflow to both capture these behaviors as well as be able to explore these behaviors and how they interact with other behaviors. So not doing things in a silo, but as a system of systems, as was mentioned in the introduction. So a lot of focus has been put in the mobility and decision science pillar in terms of developing new models of mode and timing choice, value of time and time use, telecommute behavior, vehicle sharing behaviors, e-commerce, as Anna just mentioned, and vehicle technology choices. And these have all been incorporated in the smart workflow, and the impacts have been evaluated through scenario analysis, as well as through evaluation of the sensitivity of the overall model outcomes to both key parameters for each model and parameters across models. Important to note here, and there is a reference slide later in the presentation, that many of these findings were not only used in service of improving the system modeling workflow, but also were general research in themselves and published in multiple peer-reviewed journals. Just some highlights, so I won't go into every behavioral study that's been done and incorporated into the simulation models, but some highlights here include work that has been done on exploring the value of travel time savings and time use that have been explored from a perspective of different modes and setting up for the what-if analysis of time use and time shift in new modes. So a few papers by Kruger et al. And Anam et al. Recently published have really been exploring how we incorporate different data from multiple sources, whether it's household travel surveys, time use surveys, onboard transit surveys, or more speculative surveys to develop an integrated choice and latent variable framework to quantify not only the value of travel time, but how that travel time shifts under the multitasking and time use opportunities posed by different modes. Some of the key findings we get out of this research are that, one, there is significant variation in terms of what we find for the value of travel time when we look at different sources. But generally, across sources, we see that the ability to multitask encourages the use of non-drive modes, as well as reduces the value of travel time experienced on those modes. And that plays into the idea of future automated vehicles serving as a multitasking and new time use space that could potentially lower the cost of travel in such vehicles. There's also been substantial work on improving baseline mode and timing choice models, some of that published in Golshani et al. 2018. So we have a mode model developed for Chicago from the Chicago Household Travel Survey that uses a nested logic model to look at the choice between different modal options in a nested framework. And we find here that the value of in-vehicle time varies substantially by mode, activity purpose, expected travel time and congestion and travel time variability, and so on. A lot of these different system-level factors as well as individual factors that help to explain how in-vehicle travel time is perceived by different travelers in different contexts. We also looked at modeling a joint start time and duration model to say what time of day people choose to travel for and how long they engage in activities at the end of that travel. And this key finding here was that this depends strongly on the activity purpose, as well as the expected travel time and travel time variability in reaching that destination. So accessibility and access to high quality activity opportunities strongly influence when and how often people tend to travel. There's also been work at looking at how AVs, as we focus on automated vehicle technologies, how those would impact household behavior. One of the initial studies being done on AV sharing in households to see how households could optimally use an AV that has the ability to reposition itself to minimize cost for daily travel in terms of the number of vehicles required and operational costs, parking costs, time costs, and so on, to say how can households shift both their activity patterns, their activity start time and durations to get the most use out of a single vehicle. And this was implemented in External Optimizer and many studies, including Alder 2019, deriving findings out of that. Finally, one other highlight of the behavioral research that went into the simulation frameworks is looking at e-commerce. And this will be presented in much more detail in the next upcoming webinar, but some work that Stinson et al. Had done in conjunction with the Whole Traveler team, looking at how households participate in e-commerce, as Anna mentioned in the last slide, and looking at how this displaces physical shopping trips. So exploring that through a system framework to see what is the overall impact. And what we find is that the desire or households replacing physical shopping with deliveries is dependent strongly on income, the number of vehicles that household owns, the location where they live, and then their accessibility to both retail and transit travel opportunities, and that the overall outcomes from replacing those shopping trips have varying impacts in terms of overall system travel and energy efficiency, depending on where they live and how frequently they shop. So that was a lot of the background work that went into improving the workflows, the modeling workflows developed as part of SMART, so that have been presented in previous of the webinars in the webinar series. We then applied these workflows, as has been presented previously, to a variety of potential almost corner case future scenarios, looking at different levels of sharing and automation and as well as other technologies and how those interact. So we have a near-term case of high sharing, but partial automation. So this is a slightly more automated, but much more expanded version of the existing TNC fleets. There's a high sharing, high automated version, which is basically that same scenario, but then we automate the vehicles and have a lot of advanced technology in the vehicles where they can operate fully autonomously, and as well as having expanded e-commerce opportunities. And then there's a low sharing version of that high automation scenario where we have the same advanced vehicles, but now they're privately owned by households. Through this simulation analysis, we find that these individual traveler behavior changes drive strongly the mobility outcomes. So just looking at some of the behavioral models and how that filters through these simulations, we see that as we look at these different scenarios, mode share changes substantially, driven by a number of different factors. So we see that transit use grows from about 6% all the way up to 12% when we have both high sharing and high automation. as households dispose of those vehicles as they come to rely on the automated vehicle service, but then can actually take more transit trips since they do not have the vehicles to rely on anymore when the transit is the more efficient option. Conversely, we find that private AV does encourage additional shared private vehicle trips, even in the case where household vehicles are disposed. Now we're back to almost, if you sum up all of the privately owned vehicle trips, it'll be about 70% versus the 78% in the baseline. And we do see that urban households shift to transit while suburban households shift largely to TNC, although there is some mixing and driven by this vehicle disposal. And a lot of the impact of the shared vehicles comes from this assumed lower value of travel time savings. This is the monetary cost a traveler would pay to avoid spending an additional hour in travel. But one thing is that this value of travel time savings differs greatly by mode, income, location, trip purpose, and so on. And what we find when we run a simple scenario analysis in the Polaris workflow, that if we reduced VOTT by 50% across the board, it doesn't mean people travel 50% more. It means some households, for example, in the core suburban areas, we can see, these outlying areas around the city of Chicago, have about a 52% increase in their overall travel as they're less deterred by spending more time in the car. They travel further to more high-quality activity opportunities. Whereas people in the downtown area only travel about a third more, so the average increase of about 5 miles per capita, because they're already basically surrounded by a large amount of high-quality, heterogeneous, for different activity purposes, activity locations. So there's no real need to travel further, even though traveling further would not be more costly for them due to the reduced VOT. So this is highly geographic and context dependent in terms of what impact this VOTT shift would have. Playing into that, or building on that, we see that the automated vehicles have this major effect on travel behavior because of this assumed ability of people to refocus from the driving task to other productive time uses tasks. And even if it's not another non-productive time use, it's still less burdensome to not have to drive and focus on the road, which lowers the cost, and as we saw on the previous slide, means people travel further for their activity opportunities if it's beneficial. So what we see when we run through the high automated privately owned AV scenario is that the average household travels about 82% more miles on average. 57% of those are person miles, so actual people traveling further, and then the rest from the vehicle repositioning. And then if we compare those households with the households that don't own AVs, even in the same scenario, we see this effect pretty clearly. So this 82% increase in households that own an AV is largely driven by increased discretionary activity trip making. So as we mentioned, going to a better restaurant, a more advantageous shopping location, traveling to see more distant friends, we have an average 3 to 6 mile longer per trip travel time, an increase of about 30% from baseline for largely discretionary trip activities. And so we see that the average person with an AV spends about 30 minutes more per day in travel due to that lower travel time cost and more opportunity for engaging in other activity types. In a related finding, through the BEAM workflow coupled with the urban sim model, we see that the lower subjective travel costs, so the lower VOT, also would affect the demand for land outside of the urban core. So all the scenarios where we're reducing VOT have the effect of increasing accessibility through the reduced generalized travel time costs. And this would lead to more demand to shift residences and businesses further from the urban core, which was most prevalent, as shown in the chart on the right, in the high sharing, high automation scenario, where basically people, due to the lower travel time cost, can reach further jobs in less dense areas, which has the effect of increasing land values further from CBD and inducing urban sprawl. Now, to counteract that, one other key finding of our behavioral research is that transit is critical to mobility. So one way to demonstrate this is we ran a scenario in the Chicago model without transit, and we find that without transit, the energy use and congestion increase in the city of Chicago to an unacceptable level. So changes in link level speed throughout the Chicago network shown on the map at left here. And we see that in the city of Chicago without transit, there's about a 29% increase in energy use, a 37% increase in miles traveled, and a 52% increase in hours traveled, so a substantial increase in congestion throughout the region. However, this doesn't have to be the case. So transit and ride-hail, so even in a world of increased ride-hail and automated ride-sharing deployment, we see that transit and ride-hail can be actually complementary and work together to provide key mobility, especially in denser areas, where we see that transit still is a key mobility provider in the city and along major corridors, whereas TNC serves the more less dense suburban areas. So if we look at transit ridership and TNC ridership across our moderately automated and high automated shared vehicle scenarios, we see that transit mode grows fairly substantially in the areas of high quality existing transit and along the main sort of hub and spoke system in Chicago, even as TNC use also grows in many of those areas where these form almost a mirror image of each other, where transit growing in the core area and TNC being used extensively everywhere else. And this happens even as TNC use increases in these areas as well. So some, in this case, indirect complementarity. We also explored direct complementarity between transit and TNCs. So we found that integration of these systems can produce benefits beyond what would just be seen in the previous simulation study. In this case, we applied it to our small-scale Bloomington, Illinois, sort of a moderately sized city in Illinois, about 100,000 people, with a fairly low-density, low-utilized transit network, about 1.3% of people taking trips by transit in a baseline, and it's all bus network. What we found in this case is we could have a system where we integrate first mile, last mile service from TNC with the transit fares and increase transit ridership by about 11% through only adding about 4,000 extra TNC VMT miles, so about 4,000 extra miles into the system from this first mile, last mile access would reduce total VMT by about 33,000 miles, so about a 1.4% reduction in total VMT, 1.1% reduction in fuel, and 11% increase in transit mode shift with this moderate integration. So we found that this could be an effective strategy that could be put in place to boost transit ridership in a low utilization scenario. Conversely, again, a finding through the BEAM workflow, we find that reducing ride-hail usage does also overall affect transit ridership and total energy. So when we reduce ride-hail, we result in lower use of transit and higher use of personal vehicles, leading to, in a high reduction case where we have about a 75% reduction in the pool of travelers considering ride-hail, we have an overall increase of 6% in terms of energy use. So we do find, although that in some instances ride-hail trips can produce more VMT than car trips, the loss of this ride-hail to transit mode offsets this that potential downside, meaning that overall our system is worse off when many fewer people are considering ride-hail. And then just to build on the work that Anna had mentioned in the first portion of the presentation, we also looked at this e-commerce on a household level and how that would filter in through system findings. And we found that when we have more e-commerce deliveries overall, we can actually, in many instances, reduce system miles traveled and energy use. And that's due to replacing shopping trips with more delivery trips, whereas even though the delivery trip is generally implemented with a less efficient vehicle, usually some type of medium-duty box truck, adding additional stop on an efficiently planned delivery tour, where there tends to be 120, 140 stops, only would add about a less than half a mile, marginal increase in miles traveled on average to that delivery tour. Whereas the average shopping trip in simulation findings and survey analysis, looking across the country, tends to be about 7 to 8 miles one way. So replacing this, if it was a one-to-one replacement with a shopping trip versus an e-commerce delivery, there's a clear gain. It's not always one-to-one, but there's clear gains in terms of overall VMT and energy use. And again, we'll go more into detail on these results in the next talk in the webinar series. So just some high-level takeaways before we move into the Q&A portion. The idea behind all of this work was really on trying to understand the motivations and constraints facing individual travelers to lead to more realistic scenarios when we do our scenario analysis of future technology deployment and future, let's say, urban mobility design. So we understand that people make the choices they make for a reason, and the idea is to try to capture those through the workflow that we use for future what-if scenario planning analysis. So in the SMART, in the initial set of scenarios, we did look at a limited set of edge cases, some of which assumed relatively high willingness to use certain modes or technologies, such as shared ride-hail, and made fixed assumptions in terms of shifts in value of travel time and so on. But the results from the MDS demonstrate that the extent to which people might face constraints, given their context or life choices, may limit the actual ability to adopt these different technologies that are specified in the scenario design for some of these alternatives. So it's going to be good to continue looking into these individual, unique, heterogeneous reasons that people make or don't make choices to understand how those would filter into the scenario analysis. So understanding why these constraints can inform which scenarios are realistic and why. To do simulation under analysis. So the simulation findings really underscore why this deeper understanding matters when we're trying to look at system-wide outcomes for planning and really understanding what the deployment of these different technologies, what the impacts will have, and better managing those. So just a couple quick references. I won't read through these, but they're available for those who want to look and download the slides. This is a sampling of the work that's been done under the VMS or the MDS pillar as a part of Smart Mobility. And with that, I'll say thank you, and we can pass control.
All right. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Anna, for those presentations. We have just about 12 minutes for Q&A, and so we'll go ahead and get started with that. Again, I'll remind everyone to enter your questions in the Q&A box on your screen. The first question we have is for Anna. The question says, did your study take into account impacts on wealth for the different generations? The questioner would be curious to know how things like the recession that was experienced a little over a decade ago, how that impacted, for example, the millennials' ability to earn wealth, which may impact adoption of more expensive technologies. So, Anna, do you have a response to that?
Yes, that's a good question. So when we looked at the results that I presented with respect to those generations, we did do an analysis that controlled for, we didn't control for wealth, but we did control for household income. I would say that the main, that factor asked about is definitely going to be important from the perspective of actual adoption of these technologies. The analysis I did present on was more about people saying they were interested in adopting the technology. So that's a little bit of a different angle on it, but I would agree with the question's premise that that wealth and the ability to pay for these things is going to have a big impact on the actual potential kind of market penetration and rollout of these technologies.
Great, thank you. I have another, actually two questions that are very similar, so I'll go ahead and ask them both. They're really for both of you, but maybe we'll start with Josh and then Anna weigh in. So the two questions are, how are the results from the empirical data used to make better models? Do you have an example? And so the empirical data that Anna discussed, how's that used to make better models, such as those that Josh discussed? The other similar question here is, have any of the insights that Anna presented informed any of the specifications or the scenarios for the simulation results that Josh presented? So I'll start with Josh. Can you speak to how the data efforts that Anna described feed into or inform the modeling work that you discussed?
Sure. Yes, there's a pretty direct connection there. One of the example that we touched on in the presentation is around this issue of e-commerce. So the data we used in estimating that model was directly from, and even some of the findings that used to inform the model structure was directly from the work that Anna and the whole Traveler team had done on collecting and analyzing that data. So looking at the different substitution rates and understanding, which shopping trips would get converted to deliveries and which would be, basically induced demand or extra trip when e-commerce increases. All of those went into the specification of the household level e-commerce engagement model that we ended up estimating and incorporating into the Polaris workflow. And there are similar findings around, let's say ride-hail engagement that went into the Beam model specification and others. So it's definitely the case that either directly or indirectly, many of the findings from whole traveler went into the specification of the larger simulation studies. And Anna, if you want to build on that, especially for the beam case.
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, I think you summarized in terms of the work done in SMART 1.0. That's an accurate description. I will say we're kind of trying to go even further in this next round of work that we're just now starting. In particular, in the beam model, there's a lot of emphasis being put into integrating some of the insights we gained from with regard to sort of the life cycle factors and how that feeds through kind of vehicle choice and residence location choice, and also mode choice with respect to kind of sensitivity of different preferences for people in different life cycle phases and patterns.
Great, thanks. Thanks, both of you. There's another question, and I can't tell immediately which result is referring to. The question is, the ride-hailing scenario increased overall fuel consumption due to deadheadings. Does it reduce overall cost, given that customers do not need to own a vehicle? The phrasing implies that might be a modeling result, but do either of you recall which result that might be referring to?
The Ride Austin one, but it might be the workflow stuff. I'm not sure.
That sounds like the Ride Austin. I think the workflow, there was conflicting findings to that, so that some of the shared scenarios reduced overall energy consumption. So I would guess that's the Ride Austin finding.
Yeah, and I would say, at least in that analysis, I don't think they looked at total cost. So I don't think I can speak to the exact answer to that question.
Yeah, fair enough. I concur with that. Another question, which is really to both of you, and we'll start with Anna. How do you study what people are going to do when faced with a technology that doesn't really exist yet? So I guess, Anna, on your survey work and empirical data work, and Josh in the modeling and simulation side, you're both looking at technologies that aren't prolific yet. So how do you do that study? Let's start with Anna.
Well, I mean, that's the question, isn't it? I think that, anyone who's trying to study anything with regard to, for example, connected and automated vehicles is going to be facing the same question and the same difficulty. The way that we've chosen to grapple with it in our case, especially in the whole traveler study, was to try to get at some of those underlying factors that provide a deeper understanding of the underlying motivations and restrictions that could be translatable to contexts that haven't emerged yet. And that's across the range of different technologies and services we were looking at. So from that, it's not like we, emerge with a final be-all and end-all single parameter value of the propensity to adopt connected and automated vehicles, for example, but that it, contributes to a better understanding of what might matter and what might not. And then that coupled with, increased results from other survey work and field experiments and other things over time, the idea is that these models get tuned up and improved upon more and more over time. And, we just all do the best we can, I think.
Yeah, I would generally agree with all that and say, a lot of the work and a lot of the focus is really just on learning from analogs and extending what we already know about how these behaviors go into these assumed future technologies. And there are a lot of analogs out there and a lot of different data out there when we're talking about something like an AV, for example. It's a very new technology, but it's not fundamentally something different than, it's basically an Uber with no driver, right? So there are definitely a lot of studies and a lot of data being collected around this topic that do allow us to at least make some educated guesses about how people will behave in these circumstances.
All right, thanks both of you for that. I have a question on the whole traveler survey, so I think this is for Anna. The results presented on e-commerce from whole traveler were interesting, but it seems like there would be a lot of variation across different households. Did you look at this variation?
Yeah. In particular, what we looked at is variation across households with respect to whether they had young children at home, and also whether with respect to household income. And that we do reference in the slides that Josh showed on the references, there's a journal article where you can go into more detail on those sets of results. But one of the interesting takeaways we kind of got from that level of the analysis was basically that, when we look at those with higher incomes or those with children, which we might think of as those with higher opportunity cost for their time or higher kind of demand for their time, we don't necessarily see that e-commerce is replacing more shopping trips, but what we do see is the likelihood that e-commerce is replacing more other types of time-consuming behaviors, like cooking at home, for example.
Okay, thanks. I might throw my own question in here to Josh to kind of follow up on that. How do you, in the agent-based models, how do you account for that heterogeneity across different households in the model? Is that taken into consideration?
Yes, when the model was estimated, we did look at all these different factors, some of the obvious ones like income level, but some less obvious ones like their accessibility to take transit, their accessibility to nearby retail. So really looking at more of the geographic distribution and the transportation system distribution and incorporating that into some of the model estimation to really, and that's tying back in this e-commerce behavior into the larger transportation system effects we're trying to model, and especially that we're trying to change through different scenarios. So we did capture probably not as much of the heterogeneity on the individual level as what was being explored on the whole traveler side, but we did capture some of that in terms of the household size, the income level, and so on.
All right, thanks. Maybe time for one more question here. There's a question that asks, have you done similar studies for people living in rural areas? So I'll add to that, I know a lot of the whole traveler behavioral study results came from the San Francisco region. A lot of the Polaris results and the Beam results came from the Chicago region and San Francisco, respectively. So what about studies for people living in rural areas? Maybe start with Josh on this one.
So rural, for sure, is definitely included in the studies that we run. So when we say Chicago area, it's Chicago, but it's also about, I think, 10,000 square miles around Chicago. So our Chicago metro model goes up, past Kenosha in Wisconsin, past Rockford in Illinois, and past, I think, South Bend or Michigan City in Indiana. So it's a very wide geography that encompasses all different urban forms. And some of the results we presented today were coming out of our Bloomington, Illinois model, which is sort of a rural to small townish area in Illinois. So we do try to apply these across different region types just to capture geographic heterogeneity and the ways people access, take shopping trips, socialize, for example, do tend to be quite different in different geographic contexts. We want to make sure that's representable in the workflow. So that's why that these models tend to cover a wide region, and then there is ongoing efforts as a part of the Smart Mobility program to extend these models to different areas of the country. So we're not just focusing on 2 cities. We really want to capture a broad swath of the country when we're doing analysis like this.
All right. I'm showing 4 o'clock Eastern time, so I'm afraid we're going to have to end there. Again, thank you to Anna Spurlock from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and Josh Auld from Argonne National Lab for being our technical speakers today. And thank you to everyone who joined us and who submitted questions. I'll remind you, if you want some more information about the results and findings from Smart Mobility, you can download our 6 Capstone reports at the link shown on your screen here. You can also download presentations and videos from previous webinars. Additionally, at that same link, you can register to attend our final 2 webinars. One is 2 weeks from today, focused on moving goods in the Smart Mobility system. And then 2 weeks after that, we will wrap up the series looking at EV charging infrastructure in the Smart Mobility system. So again, thank you for attending. Please read the reports and please register for our future webinars. Thank you, everyone. And stay safe.